From a small city to an empire spanning continents, Rome's rise was as spectacular as its fall was catastrophic. Discover the journey of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire comes from the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic was established back in 509 BCE when the last Roman king, Tarquin the Proud, was overthrown. The new government established was characterized by a system of checks and balances with its consuls elected annually, and this was relatively successful. There were few problems in the earliest days of the Roman Republic. That is until 494 BC. The first secession of the plebeians or summoners demanded political rights, which led to the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs, which has the power to protect commoners against patrician magistrates or families of powerful Romans. Fearing they would be unjustly tried for any crimes they could commit in the future, the plebeians were surprised that an office was made to protect them going forward, and this would set a precedent for Rome that had not been seen before really. Rules and laws and regulations were being put in place. They were not building a colony, they were building a society. The law of the 12 Tables was created, which was a written code of laws that both patricians and plebeians had to follow, therefore putting both sides of the class system on the same level when it came to the law. The law of the 12 Tables had a couple of key points. Table 1 talked about court procedures, how people would be tried in a court of law both fairly and constitutionally. Table 2 talked about further enactments on trials, which included things such as financial stake within a trial, as well as litigation, what to do if you feel the judge is impaired, as well as who must prevent evidence. Table 3 talks about the execution of judgment, settling how long debts can be paid, mainly saying they had to be settled within 30 days. Table 4 represents the rights of family members and deals with rights that specifically affect families. However, one of these rights was rather cruel, as any babies who were, as quoted, dreadfully deformed, they would be euthanized or killed by the father. It also points out that sons are born into the inheritance of their family in the event of the death of their father. It mainly protects the patriarchs of families, as can be seen by one point stating a man can kick out his wife and order her to mind her own affairs. And then finally, Table 4 sets out that if a father tries and fails to sell his son 3 times, then the son earns freedom from the father. Table 5, 6, and 10 of the 12 Tables are set out to protect the limited rights that women had. Table 5 is in relation to estates and guardianships and states that female heirs should remain under guardianship unless they are a Vestal virgin or a priestess of Vesta, the goddess of home, hearth, and family. Table 6 talks about ownership and possession and states that where a woman who has not been united to a man in marriage lives with him for an entire year without interruption of 3 nights, she shall pass into his power as his legal wife, essentially meaning that if a woman lives with a man for a year, she automatically becomes his wife. And then finally, Table 10 of women's rights is in relation to religion and states that women cannot lacerate their faces or tear their cheeks with their nails, nor shall they utter loud cries bewailing the dead. Table 7 lays out the rules and regulations surrounding land rights and crimes, with rules such as boundary disputes, road widths, people who live near roads have to maintain them, and then property owners can remove trees that have blown onto their property, but not fruit. If fruit blows into your garden, the person who owns the tree owns the fruit. Table 8 of the 12 Tables lays out that it is illegal for anyone to define what a citizen of Rome is, with the exception of the Maximus Comitatus. It also outlaws execution of those who are unconvicted, bribery of judges, as well as extradition of a citizen to enemy powers. And then finally, Table 9 and 11 are supplementary laws which are not massively needed. Table 9 points out that a person of a certain class cannot marry someone from a lower class, and then Table 12 states that if a slave commits theft or done damage with his master's knowledge, he will be punished, and that punishment will become the slave's name. These 12 Tables are long and convoluted, but they set an important precedent for Roman law going forward. They also provide an early example of some of the key pillars of Roman culture, mainly justice, equality, and punishment. However, these laws prevented plebeians from holding office of consul, meaning that by 367 BC, the plebeians had enough, and the Licinian Sextian laws were written up to balance the political power between the plebeians and the patriarchs. This was then continued in 287 BC, when the Lex Hortensia was made to make decisions on behalf of the plebeian council, finally ending the political struggle between the patricians and plebeians. But the Roman Republic was still relatively small, and from the years 287 to 133 BC, the Roman Republic would expand, beginning in 343 BC when the Samnite Wars began. The Samnite Wars were wars fought between the Roman Republic and the Samnites, a group of ancient Italic people who lived on a stretch of the Apennine Mountains just south of Rome and north of the Lucanian tribes. The first of these wars came after Rome intervened to rescue the city of Capua from a Samnite attack. By the time of this war, Rome's southern expansion had reached the river Liris, now called Garigliano, which at the time was the boundary between Latium and Capmania, or as it is called nowadays, Lazio and Campania. The war began not because of any animosity between the Romans and the Samnites, but rather due to external factors. The war began when the Samnites, without any provocation, attacked the Sidicini, a small tribe north of Campania. Unable to withstand the onslaught of the Samnites, the Sidicini sought help from the Campanians. However, the Samnites defeated the Campanians with relative ease and so turned their attention towards Campania. They were coming dangerously close to Rome at this point, and after the Campanians were defeated twice by the Samnites, they turned to Rome for help. The Campanians met with the Roman Senate. In a speech before the Senate, the Campanians proposed an alliance between Rome and Campania, noting that the Campanians were very wealthy, and this could be very valuable to Rome, as well as being able to subdue another enemy of the Romans, the Volsci. Rome did have a treaty with the Samnites at this point. However, the Campanians warned that without Rome's help, the Samnites would completely take over Campania. The Senate took a moment to discuss the deal with the Campanians and pointed out that the deal would give them a lot to gain and that the fertile area with Campania could be useful to them. However, considering they had a pre-existing treaty with the Samnites, they were unfortunately unable to reach a deal with Campania. The Campanians had no other choice, and as such, had to surrender their people and city of Capua unconditionally into the power of Rome. Now a part of Rome, the senators decided that their allegiance to the Campanians would be far more beneficial now going forward than their treaty with the Samnites, and so their allegiance changed. Now that Rome owned part of Campania, they sent envoys to meet with the Samnites with instructions to spare territory, which had become a part of Rome, and to warn them to keep their hands off of the city of Capua, as well as the territory of Campania. The envoys did their job and delivered the message. However, the Samnites refused, and instead marched into Campanian territory with the intention of ravaging it. When the news of this reached Rome, the Fetials or priests were sent to demand redress, and when the Samnites refused this, Rome declared war on them. In 343 BC, the two Roman consuls, Marcus Valerius Corvus and Aulus Cornelius Cassus, marched against the Samnites. Valerius led his army into Campanian territory, while Cornelius led his into Samnite territory, where he camped at Saticula. Rome then won 3 consecutive battles against the Samnites. First, Valerius beat the Samnites at Mount Garus, near Cumae, after a last-ditch charge during sunset. The second battle almost ended in disaster when the Samnites tried to trap Cornelius and his army in a mountain pass. However, one of Cornelius's high-ranking military officials seized a nearby hilltop. It is here that military tribune Publius Decius Mus, while distracting the Samnites and allowing Cornelius to charge towards Sucella after the stragglers, defeated the Samnite army. The Samnites were low on supplies, and their numbers were dwindling, and as such, they had no other choice but to scatter the army in Susuela to find food, which led to the third and final victory, came when Valerius took the opportunity to seize their camp in Susuela and kill any of the stragglers who had gotten away. And this success was huge for Rome. Not only did they attain all of the land of Campania, but their military prowess had intimidated neighboring communities such as the Latins, Falerii, and Carthage. This all began the expansion of the Roman Republic and established their dominance across central Italy. However, peacetime would not last long, as only 30 years later, the Romans would find themselves at war once again against a community that was meant to be their ally. In 264 BC, the First Punic War began. Rome was expanding rapidly after their successes during the Samnite Wars. However, their expansion began to encroach a little bit too close to the Carthage territory. In Italy, and this part of Europe at this time, Carthage controlled basically all of the southern coast of Sicily. However, Rome was beginning to come a little bit closer to their territory of Carthage. This caused Carthage to react quite aggressively. Carthage was the dominant power within the Western Mediterranean and had an extensive seaside empire, as well as a huge navy compared to Rome's well-known navy. The war first began when Romans gained a foothold in Sicily at Messana in 264 BC. They then began to press Syracuse, which was the only significant independent power on the island, into allying with them against Carthage. 2 years later, the Carthaginian army of 50,000 foot soldiers, 6,000 cavalry, and 60 elephants tried to kick Rome out of Syracuse, but were horrendously defeated at the Battle of Acragas. That same night, the Carthaginian garrison escaped, and the Romans seized the city and all of its inhabitants, selling 25,000 of them into slavery. After this horrendous loss by the Carthaginians, they decided to go into damage control and fortify their towns and cities that were a bit better defended. However, given that the Romans predominantly attacked on land, they were able to fortify themselves by using the ocean to transport supplies. This meant that the Carthaginians had fortified entirely the inland and had left the coast relatively defenseless, as the Romans had basically no navy. So what did the Romans do? Well, they made a navy to challenge the Carthaginians. Using this newly established navy, the Roman Empire was able to land a major defeat in the lap of Carthage at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC. They then lost again at a Carthaginian base on Corsica. However, their attack on Sardinia was prevented. Rome had actually made a pretty powerful navy, and in a very short amount of time, and with this navy in tow, Rome decided to launch more invasions. First, they invaded Africa in 256 BC, which the Carthaginians were able to intercept at Cape Ecnomus off the southern coast of Sicily. This battle quickly turned chaotic, but ultimately the Carthaginian navy lost once again, and this could potentially be the largest naval battle in all of history based on the number of soldiers. And there were countless more battles. The Battle of Tunis came next, where Spartan mercenary Xanthippus crushed the Romans. Then was the Battle of Cape Hermaeum, where the Carthaginians were desecrated. However, as a result of this, the Roman navy was severely wounded, and a storm while returning to Italy caused them to lose most of their ships. From 255 BC, 241 BC, the Romans and Carthaginians kept most of their fighting on the island of Sicily. In 255 BC, the Carthaginians attacked and recaptured Acragas, but were unconfident in their ability to hold it, and as such they ransacked it and abandoned it. After losing so much of their navy in the Battle of Cape Hermaeum, the Romans very quickly rebuilt their navy and captured Panormus in 254 BC. On Sicily, the Romans avoided battle in 252 and 251 BC because they feared the war elephants that the Carthaginians had brought in. And then came 250, the Carthaginians advanced on Panormus, but the Romans were able to drive off their war elephants with javelins. Instead, the elephants charged through the Carthaginian army after being diverted, which crushed countless soldiers and weakened the army enough for Rome to come in and win the battle. Slowly, the Romans began to capture more and more of Sicily. In the tail end of 250 BC, they took over the last two Carthaginian strongholds of Lilybaeum and Dapana in the extreme west. The siege of Lilybaeum in particular lasted 9 years, which the Romans eventually won. However, they were taking huge losses at sea to the Carthaginian navy. They were decimated at the Battle of Drepana, which was Carthage's greatest ever naval victory, and at the Battle of Phintius, the Roman navy was crippled, and it took them 7 years to rebuild their entire navy. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian navy just built more ships. After over 2 years at war, both states were financially exhausted. Carthage were requesting soldiers from Egypt, and Rome was close to bankruptcy, with the number of adult men decreasing by 17% since the beginning of the war. The Romans finally rebuilt their naval fleet in 243 BC, after the Senate approached the patricians of Rome to finance the construction of one ship each, which would be repaid by the reparations from the Carthaginian citizens after the war was won. This new fleet successfully blockaded the Carthaginian garrisons, and after Carthage assembled a fleet which was destroyed by the Romans, the cut of Carthaginian troops on Sicily were forced to negotiate for peace. As such, the Treaty of Lutatius was agreed, which forced Carthage to pay 3,200 talents of silver, or roughly 82,000 kilograms, in reparations to the Roman Empire, and Sicily was annexed as a Roman province. Polybius regarded the war as the longest, most continuous, and most severely congested war known to us in history, and the war cemented Rome's military power in the Western Mediterranean, and also throughout the entirety of Europe. The amount of effort of repeatedly building huge fleets of ships is what led to Rome's total naval dominance that would go on to last 600 years. However, this was only the first of the Punic Wars, since there would be 2 more yet to come. The Second Punic War began in 219 BC, when a Carthaginian army under Hannibal captured and ransacked Saguntum, a province just 5 minutes outside of Roman land. Worried about the approaching Carthaginian branches, Rome declared war on the Carthaginians once again, and the Second Punic War would not quite go as planned for the Romans. In 218 BC, there were some small skirmishes between the Romans and the Carthaginians, with the Romans able to capture Malta. However, in northern Italy, the Gallic tribes, or the Celts as we know them, were attacking Roman colonies, causing the settlers to flee to their old colony. A Roman relief force was sent to take on the Celts, but were defeated themselves. While this was ongoing, Hannibal was assembling an army in New Carthage in Iberia to take on Gaul to have a good vantage point against the Romans. At the Battle of the Rhone crossing, Hannibal defeated a force of local Gauls, which sought to bar his way to taking on Rome. Following this, a Roman fleet carrying men intended to attack Iberia landed in Marseille just before Rhone to take on Hannibal. However, Hannibal evaded them and raced them towards the north. Hannibal beat the Roman Empire to the Alps, and with an army of 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, he entered the Italian peninsula. This act by Hannibal would go on to change the course of history, as the Romans canceled their planned invasion of Africa to instead take on the threats of the Gallic tribes to the north, and Rome lost a lot. First, they were defeated at the Battle of Ticinus, then again at the Battle of the Trebia. They were then ambushed by Hannibal at the Battle of Lake Trasimene, where the entire Roman army was desecrated, and this made Rome panic. They had been a dominant military force for ages now, but Hannibal was running circles around them. After the heavy defeats, Rome felt they had to appoint a dictator, and did as such, appointing Quintus Fabius as their dictator with sole charge over the war effort. Fabius introduced the Fabian strategy to war, avoiding open battle with the opponent, but constantly skirmishing with small detachments of the enemy. This was not a very popular method with the Roman army, public, or senate, since he avoided battle while Italy was being devastated by Hannibal. Hannibal went on to march through the richest and most fertile provinces of Italy, trying to pull Fabius into battle, although Fabius refused. In the 216 BC elections, Gaius Varro and Lucius Paulus were elected as consuls, both being far more aggressively minded than Fabius before them. It is here that the Roman Senate authorized the creation of an army of 86,000 men, the largest army in Roman history at this point. Paulus and Varro marched south towards Hannibal, who accepted battle on the open plain of Cannae. In the Battle of Cannae, the Roman legions forced their way through Hannibal's deliberately weak center, while the heavier infantry ran around the open wings. The goal for Hannibal here was to surround the Romans, which he did successfully, and this led to roughly 7,500 Romans being killed or captured by Hannibal and the Carthaginians. After their staggering defeat, the Roman allies began to defect to the Carthaginians, and it was believed that this would be the end of the Roman Empire. Carthage had recaptured Capua, Tarentum, and had convinced countless allies and former foes of Rome to help their cause, including the Samnites. However, Rome would go down swinging. First, they defeated the Carthaginian army at the Battle of Dertosa. which forced the Carthaginian squad, led by Hannibal's younger brother Mago, to redirect to Iberia. While distracted, the Roman army took drastic measures to rebuild their army. They raised new legions, enrolled slaves, criminals, and people who would not have been eligible to become a soldier. By 215, they had 12 legions, with an excess of 100,000 soldiers, ready to attack Hannibal and the Carthaginians. And 12 years after the Battle of Cannae, Romans were recapturing lost land. Hannibal defeated countless armies, however Rome was employing more of the Fabian strategy of attacking smaller armies, while Hannibal was getting victories. By 207 BC, Hannibal had been forced into the very south of Italy, and many of the people who left the Romans for Carthage had returned back to the Republic. But Rome was not done there. Outraged at the Carthaginians, they decided to fight back. First, they elected a consul by the name of Claudius Nero to march north and reinforce the Romans facing Hannibal's younger brother Hasdrubal. Then Mago's army was defeated in the Po Valley at the Battle of Insubria in 203 BC. And the finale of this war would be somewhere quite unexpected. You see, while this war was waging in Italy, a powerful Numidian king in North Africa would ally himself with Rome, declaring that all he had was Roman. As such, Roman advisors were sent to train up soldiers to fight against the Carthaginian ally Gela. This ploy by the Romans was intended to weaken the supply chain of the Carthage army, and it worked for 8 years until the Carthaginians divided the Numidian kingdoms under the king, making some of them even more sympathetic to Rome and some of them very hostile towards the king. In 205 BC, Publius Scipio was given command over the legions in Sicily and was allowed to enroll volunteers for his plan to end the war by invading Africa. After landing in Africa in 204 BC, he met with Numidian Prince Massinissa and a force of Numidian cavalry. Scipio used these extra soldiers to take out 2 large Carthaginian armies. Both countries were exhausted once again. They had been fighting on and off for decades at this point, and so Rome and Carthage saw no other option than to enter peace treaties with the Carthaginians. The Roman Senate created a draft treaty, but as a result of mistrust and a surge of confidence when Hannibal arrived from Italy, Carthage refuted the treaty. Hannibal was put in charge of an army formed from his and Mago's veteran soldiers from Italy, as well as newly raised troops who had escaped from Africa. This army then met the Romans at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, which would be the final battle of the war. Unlike most of the battles during the Second Punic War, the Romans actually had more cavalry than Hannibal and his army. And despite Hannibal attempting to use 80 elephants to break into the Roman infantry, the Roman and allied Numidian cavalry were able to divert them and attack the army once again. The fight was raging on, and eventually the Carthaginian formation collapsed, with Hannibal being one of very few to successfully escape the battle. The new peace treaty came after this battle, with Rome stripping Carthage of all of its overseas territories as well as some of the African ones. A reparation of 10,000 silver talents, roughly 269,000 kilograms of silver, was to be paid to Rome over 50 years. Rome would be taking hostages, and Carthage was no longer allowed to own elephants, as well as severely disabling its navy, with it being capped at 10 warships. Hannibal, knowing he was defeated, strongly accepted the treaty, and it was accepted in spring 201 BC. The Second Punic War was turbulent, but it set a real precedent about the Roman army. They could adapt, they could think on their feet, and wow, could they keep their soldiers fed and healthy. It also proved that the Roman army was huge, with them fighting countless adversaries during this war. But this would not be the final Punic War, as there was one more in 149-146 BC. The shortest of the Punic Wars, the Third Punic War, began in 149 BC when an army of 50,000 Roman soldiers landed near Utica, roughly 40 kilometers north of Carthage. Rome demanded that if war were to be avoided, the Carthaginians must hand over all of their weapons and equipment. They did so, and Rome seized 200,000 sets of armor, 2,000 catapults, and a huge amount of warships. However, Rome got greedy and demanded that the Carthaginians burn down their city and relocate to be 16 kilometers, or 10 miles away from the ocean. This was too far for the Carthaginians, and they broke off negotiations and began to recreate their armory. However, they were completely crippled. The Carthaginians had given up everything, and this small revolution caused Rome to take over all of the Carthaginian territory over the next 3 years. The Carthaginian territories were annexed and became the Roman province of Africa, with Utica as its capital. Utica went on to become a huge source of grain and food for the Romans, and Rome took over so much more. Rome had done it. Finally, they had defeated the Carthaginians. However, now it was time to address some issues at home. As a result of the war effort being so expensive, the Romans had to find ways of getting money, and one of these was land tax. Land tax had increased rapidly during the Punic Wars, and as such a member of the tribune of plebs, known as Tiberius Gracchus, had had enough. Tiberius proposed that land reforms be put in place to address the issues surrounding economic inequality between the plebs and the patricians. However, Tiberius was assassinated, which sparked some political violence within Rome. 10 years after the death of Tiberius, the issue had still not been addressed, and as such Gaius Gracchus, the brother of Tiberius, continued his brother's reform efforts, however was also killed. This sparked a dangerous political movement that would ultimately lead to some of the largest internal political conflicts within the Roman Republic, and later, the Roman Empire. In the year 91 BC, the Social War began. A war between Rome and its allies within Italy began with the rebellion of Asculum. Asculum felt that because they were now a part of the Roman Republic, they should be entitled to Roman citizenship. Essentially, these small towns and cities would govern themselves, but in the event of war, the Roman army would be able to pull soldiers from these small cities. It is argued what the Social War was actually about, as it could have been about citizenship within the Roman Empire or a revolt against the domination of the Romans, but the 3-year war barely amounted to anything, although it did bring forward someone who would prove vital to Rome's history, Julius Caesar. At the beginning of the war, the Italians mobilized 100,000 men against the Romans. However, they did so at a bizarre point in the year, close to winter, with winter slowly approaching. Those 100,000 men weakened, and as such, Rome was not very concerned. During this time, they appointed 2 new consuls, Lucius Julius Caesar and Publius Rutilius Lupus. Rome should have perhaps been slightly better prepared, however, as they did lose quite a few men, including Publius Rutilius Lupus, after he died in the Battle of the Tolenus River. However, Julius Caesar was leading armies against countless Italian revolts, first in Asculum, then in Etruria and Umbria. Caesar was truly unstoppable. With the northern front collapsing and the Italian army being divided, the war was burning out. In the end, the Italians entered peace negotiations in which Julius Caesar passed legislation allowing any Italian colony that did not revolt or lay down their arms promptly could become a Roman citizen. But Julius Caesar was still not emperor and actually would not be for a while. First, let's talk about Sulla. Sulla was a very controversial leader within the Roman Republic. Sulla was the first man of the Roman Republic to seize power through force. But how did he get there? Well, Sulla was a war hero. He was pivotal in wars against North Africa, as well as taking on Germanic tribes during the Cimbrian War, as well as Italians during the Social War. As a result, he was awarded countless medals, including the Grass Crown. However, it was Sulla's political beliefs that would ultimately affect his seizing of the throne. Sulla played a pivotal role in the long-standing battle between the 2 major political factions of the Roman Republic, the Optimates and Populares. Sulla was leader of the Optimates, the more traditionally minded faction who wanted to maintain senatorial supremacy against the social reforms being advocated by the Populares. There was a dispute regarding the command of the war against Mithridates. Originally, the command was given to Sulla by the Senate, but was withdrawn as a result of socialist dominance within the Senate. Sulla decided to march on Rome in a never-before-seen act and defeated Marian forces in battle, and established himself as consul of Rome. After he left with his army to Asia, the Populares seized power of the throne from him, and when he returned from his victory in Asia, he marched on Rome once again, this time slaughtering the Populares and their Italian allies. Sulla then declared himself Emperor of Rome, reviving the dictatorship within Rome. Sulla then proceeded to use his powers to decimate his opponents and reform Roman laws to restore power to the Senate and limit the power of the plebeians and the tribune of the plebs. In 79 BC, After reforming countless Roman laws, Sulla retired from the dictatorship and returned to his private life. But why is Sulla important? Well, he set the scene for how countless more political leaders would attain power within the Roman Republic, and this would actually also be used by Julius Caesar later on. But we are not there quite yet, as now we need to introduce Spartacus. Following the Social War, there were 2 more wars fought within the Roman Republic, and the last of these servile wars was the War of Spartacus, sometimes also called the Gladiator War. In 73 BC, 70 slave gladiators escaped from a gladiator school within Capua. They easily defeated the small Roman force sent to capture them, and within 2 years, they had built a society of 120,000 men, women, and children. The able-bodied men of this army showed they could withstand and even defeat the Roman army. Once they had escaped, the servile armies chose leaders from their numbers, selecting 2 Gallic slaves by the name of Crixus and Oenomaus, as well as Spartacus. The Roman Senate grew increasingly concerned at the growth of the slave army and their continued military successes, and eventually Rome had to field an army of 8 legions under the leadership of Marcus Licinius Crassus that destroyed the army of slaves in 71 BC. The armies of Spartacus were trapped under the power of Crassus, and with Pompey and Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus moving in to trap them, Spartacus led his final charge against Crassus, and his legions were completely decimated. This war would go on to lead to the formation of the First Triumvirate, which was a shared political alliance between Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. They used this alliance to dominate Roman politics, and while secretly working together, they were able to stand up against the Senate that had hindered them during the wars they had all previously fought in, and the triumvirate worked well enough. When Caesar entered his first consulship in 59 BC, Caesar passed an agrarian law which helped Pompey's veterans as well as settlements for them after the Third Mithridatic War. Caesar was assigned to govern over the war efforts in the province of Gaul, and the alliance was strong until 55 BC, when their relationships were becoming slightly more hostile. And one relationship in particular was that between Caesar and Pompey. In 49 BC, a civil war broke out between Julius Caesar and Pompey. The main cause of this war was the political tensions from the triumvirate, as well as where Caesar would stand in the Roman Republic upon his return after his tenure in Gaul had expired. Before the war, Caesar had led an invasion of Gaul for almost 10 years. A buildup of tensions began around with time, with both Caesar and Pompey refusing to back down, eventually breaking into civil war. Pompey and his allies used his connections to seduce the Senate into demanding Caesar give up his armies and provinces. However, Caesar refused and marched on Rome. The civil war was fought across countless countries including Italy, Illyria, Greece, Egypt, Africa, and Hispania. However, the main events happened in Greece, where Pompey defeated Caesar at the Battle of Dyrrhachium, before losing exponentially at the Battle of Pharsalus, where Pompey's army was destroyed. Caesar then proceeded to take out any remaining war heroes and province leads that opposed him. First he took on Metellus Scipio, then he took out the rest of the Pompey supporters, and then he marched into Rome, where he was made dictator perpetuo, or dictator for life, before being assassinated by the Roman Senate in 44 BC. Caesar is what everyone thinks of when they think of the Roman emperor, and you can see why. While yes, Sulla did also achieve the throne through force, Caesar was ruthless, and even defeated men he had once stood beside. However, this civil war would go on to cause some immense repercussions that would lead to the dissolution of the Roman Republic and the establishment of the Roman Empire. In 43 BC, a second triumvirate was made between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus to give them absolute power as dictators with a term of 5 years. The triumvirs were given broad powers to make and veto legislation, issue punishments for crimes, as well as appoint all other magistrates. However, this triumvirate had another goal in mind: to take down the assassins of Julius Caesar. Brutus and Cassius were responsible for the assassination of Caesar, and as such, the second triumvirate were forced to fight against the armies of Brutus and Cassius in 42 BC, where they were able to successfully defeat the assassins. This second triumvirate seemed to be far more concrete than the last, but that was all going to change as Caesarion, the son of Julius Caesar, begged to get close with Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. Octavian saw this relationship as a major threat to his power, and when Mark Antony abandoned his wife and moved to Egypt with Cleopatra, Octavian knew that he had to act. Octavian then proceeded to cut off communication between Antony and Egypt before landing on mainland Greece to proceed south. Trapped in by the Octavian army, Antony's army began to desert and switch to Octavian's side, and as such, Octavian's army far outweighed the army of Antony and Cleopatra. Antony and Cleopatra managed to get away from Octavian, however. After Octavian defeated their forces at Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra were found after committing suicide on 1st August BC. Octavian's victory was potentially the biggest turning point in Roman history. Not only was the Roman army able to defeat a foe for the first time in years with one single swoop, he also had consolidated total power over Rome. As such, he adopted the title of Princeps, meaning first citizen, and was awarded the title of Augustus, meaning revered. Augustus Octavian returned power to the Senate and began to de-dictatorship the Romans, and this is when historians argue that the Roman Republic fell and the Roman Empire truly began to rise. Beginning of the Roman Empire. However, Augustus's reign would not last very long. When Augustus took power in 27 BC, he had done everything the Second Triumvirate had originally set out to do, and he was tired. Come 14. Anno Domini, Augustus passed away and was succeeded by Tiberius. Tiberius was the stepson of Augustus, and given that Augustus knew he was getting old and frail, he spent a lot of time and energy setting up Tiberius to take the throne. Tiberius continued to work on the same beliefs as his father, focusing on consolidating the empire's finances as well as maintaining stability across all of their territory. Tiberius also delegated most of his authority to the Senate, which had a hugely positive relationship with him. However, during Tiberius's reign, there was something brewing in the background. A man by the name of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, a long-term friend of Tiberius, had been placed in control of the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit of the Roman army that served as bodyguards for high-ranking officials. Upon Sejanus' appointment, he moved the Praetorian Guard's barracks to Rome, increasing his influence throughout the city and its politics. Following this, Sejanus used his good relationship with Tiberius to manipulate him and orchestrate the removal and even execution of Sejanus' rivals, including members of the imperial family. However, Sejanus wanted more than just power within Rome. He wanted to rule the Roman Empire, and as such he conspired to kill Germanicus, the incredibly popular nephew of Tiberius, as well as any family members that could have been in the line of succession. Sejanus then proceeded to marry Livilla, Tiberius's niece, to further strengthen his claim to power. He also may have been involved in the death of her previous husband Drusus, who was Tiberius's son. After Tiberius withdrew to Capri in AD 26, Sejanus had considerable control over Rome, and he was able to use this power to further his own ambitions and remove those who opposed him through a series of purges and trials for treason. However, it took years before Tiberius found out about Sejanus's conspiracy, only finding out by 31 AD. Tiberius decided that he would secretly work against Sejanus and began to send covert orders to the Senate while pretending to side with Sejanus. By October of 18th AD, Sejanus was finally arrested at a Senate meeting where he was quickly condemned and executed. Following his execution, Tiberius purged all allies of Sejanus as well as his supporters, with many being executed or sent to exile. And Sejanus's conspiracy would create a new environment within the Roman Empire, one filled with conspiracy, suspicion, and fear across all of Rome. With the latter years of Tiberius's reign being remembered historically as years where everyone was paranoid and people were being purged, this continued all the way up to the end of Tiberius's reign in 37 AD. His death ended a reign that was marked with tyranny and suspicion, and so when Caligula succeeded the throne, people were ready for change. Now Caligula's reign was short, only lasting 4 years, and was incredibly chaotic. Caligula's reign is probably best remembered for him trying to declare himself a god. During the first part of Caligula's reign, he was loved by the Romans. He initiated bonuses to people in the military, abolished unfair taxes, and freed those who had been unfairly imprisoned. He seemed like a decent enough ruler. However, the latter years of his rulership were when things got a bit weirder. One of Caligula's most surprising acts was when he declared that he was a living god. He ordered the construction of a bridge between his palace and the temple of Jupiter, god of thunder and sky, so that he could meet with the deity. He also began to appear in public dressed up as countless gods and demigods, such as Hercules, Mercury, Venus, and Apollo. Caligula would refer to himself as Jupiter on occasion in public documents, and he removed the heads of countless god statues, replacing them with his own head. 2 temples were built to honor Caligula as a god, and at one point, he even moved to Egypt to become a living god there, being represented as the sun god on Egyptian currency. Caligula was a victim of insanity, and as such, he was not fit to lead Rome. This led to a group of guards attacking and killing Caligula at a sporting event in January 41st AD, stabbing him countless times, and then burying him in a shallow grave. The Senate then pushed to have Caligula erased from Roman history, calling him an embarrassment for Rome. Caligula's reign rocked Rome's perception of the gods and would lead to Rome committing some heinous acts against other religions going forward. When Caligula died, he was succeeded by Claudius. Claudius is probably best remembered for one thing: the Roman conquest of Britain. Under Julius Caesar in 55 BC, the Romans had established a small foothold in Britain, with them making political connections with the local tribes. However, Claudius wanted to be remembered in history, and as such, he initiated the full-scale invasion of Britain by the Roman Empire that had been in preparation for 100 years. Aulus Plautius led the charge, an invasion force of 40,000 men, including 4 legions. The Romans first landed in Kent and quickly secured a foothold here. The British tried their best to resist the Romans at countless battles. The British resistance was led by Togodumnus and Caractacus, sons of the late king of the Catuvellauni. A substantial British force met the Romans at a river crossing near Rochester at the Battle of the Medway, a battle that raged for 2 days. However, the British could not keep up with the Romans and were pushed back to the River Thames, where they were pursued by Romans across the river. Shortly after the Battle of the Thames, Togodumnus was killed, and so Plautius halted the advance and sent word for Claudius to join him for the final push. So Claudius, accompanied by the Praetorian Guard, made way to Britain in 43 AD. Due to being crippled by the Romans, 11 British tribes surrendered to Claudius, and the Romans continued to move west and north, while establishing the capital of Britain as Camulodunum. After Claudius left Britain, a man called Vespasian took a force to the west, subduing tribes and capturing settlements as he went. The force proceeded at least up to Exeter, which became a base for the Roman legion. Towards 47 AD, a new governor of Britain was installed, Publius Ostorius Scapula, who began a campaign against tribes of modern-day Wales. The tribes of southeast Wales caused countless problems for Ostorius and fiercely defended their land. Unfortunately, Ostorius died and was replaced by Aulus Didius Gallus, who brought the Welsh border under control, but did not move further into Wales. This was because Claudius was keen to avoid a difficult conflict for very little gain in the mountainous areas of upland Britain. You see, during the recent emperors, there was a growing distaste towards people of different religions, most notably Jewish people and Christian people. According to Roman historians, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because they were constantly rioting against Christians. However, the exact cause is debated even to this day. However, it did likely involve disturbances surrounding Christians spreading Christianity to Jews. After Claudius died in 54 AD, the expulsion of Jews ended, and Jews were able to return to Rome. As such, the Jewish community re-established themselves and began to play a significant role in the religious and cultural lives of the Roman people. Claudius's reign had come to an end, and once again the Roman people wanted an emperor who could stand up for the people. And so, they elected one of the most famous emperors in history, Nero. Nero was known for a couple of reasons, none of them good. In 54 AD, Nero became emperor at the age of 16 after his adopted father, Claudius, passed away. Initially, Nero's reign was positive, as he implemented good reforms and a pretty competent administration, which was largely influenced by his mother Agrippina, as well as his advisors, Seneca and Burrus. He made an effort to reduce taxes, promote public entertainment, and improve the legal system. When Nero first became emperor in 54 AD, he continued the Roman advance into Britain and implemented Quintus Veranius as governor, a man with experience dealing with irritating guerrilla tribes in the mountains of Anatolia. Veranius and his successor led a successful campaign across North Wales and killed countless Druids when he invaded Anglesey in 60 AD. However, they had to abandon their campaign in Wales after the Boudica people rebelled against the Romans, causing them to redirect their war effort. By 59 AD, Nero wanted to become more independent from his mother and his advisors, and tension between Nero and his mother reached their breaking point when she was murdered in a ploy that Nero is believed to have been involved in. Around 60 AD, the Romans had successfully suppressed the Boudica uprising in Wales, and a number of new Roman governors continued fighting their way north over the next decade or so. However, Rome would be hit by financial disaster during this conquest. In 64 AD, Rome was hit by the Great Fire of Rome, which destroyed a huge chunk of the city of Rome. Nero faced countless accusations from his subjects that he actually started the fire, and so to deflect the blame away from him, he accused Christians of starting the fire. This accusation towards Christians led to the first significant persecution of Christians in Roman history. Nero's persecution of the Christians was brutal and very public. He ordered the arrest and execution of countless Christians, subjecting them to horrendous punishments. These punishments ranged from being torn apart by dogs, crucifixion, as well as an execution method known as the Roman candle, where they would be coated in a way and then set on fire, slowly burning to death and emanating light similarly to a candle. These severe and public punishments were intended to appease public anger towards Nero and divert suspicion from him onto the Christians, and this event led to Nero being labeled as a cruel and tyrannical ruler. Towards the end of his reign, Nero became increasingly erratic, which led to huge uprising in states like Galba and Hispania. By 68 AD, Nero knew he had lost the support of the public and had been abandoned by the Praetorian Guard, and so as such Nero committed suicide and began the Year of the Four Emperors. The Year of Four Emperors is named after the four emperors who all tried and failed to reach peace in Rome. First up was Galba, the governor of Hispania. His short reign was incredibly harsh and brutal towards the public, which meant he never managed to garner the support from the public, and as such, he was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard. Succeeding Galba was Otho, a former friend and ally of Nero. Otho's rule only lasted 5 months as he faced a military defeat against the forces of Vitellius at the Battle of Bedriacum. Realizing he had no chance to stand up to Vitellius and the Germanic army, Otho committed suicide. Vitellius took over from Otho, and his reign was controversial for a vastly different reason. Vitellius's reign was very luxurious and elite, with him pulling funds from the plebeians and using it to fund his luxury, meaning that the plebeians never supported him, and he very quickly became unpopular. This lack of popularity led to Vespasian, the command of the legions in the east, to march on Rome, capturing Vitellius and executing him. Vespasian succeeded Vitellius, ending the Year of the Four Emperors and ending the chaos of the year prior. Vespasian established the Flavian dynasty and brought stability back to the Roman Empire. Vespasian ruled Rome for 10 years and faced some more challenges. Most notably was the destruction of the Second Jewish Temple. In 66 AD, the Jews in Judea revolted against Roman rule. This went on to lead to an intense conflict with a rebellion fueled by religious and political tensions, and the Jewish revolutionaries were actually garnering some successes against the Roman Empire. These successes by the Jewish armies led to Vespasian carrying out the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Titus, the son of Vespasian, led a large Roman force to besiege Jerusalem, the center point of the Jewish resistance. The siege lasted for a couple of months and was plagued with intense battles, starvation, and internal struggles amongst the Jewish factions. Come August 70th AD, the Roman forces breached Jerusalem's defenses and entered the city. They were initially ordered to spare the Jewish temple. However, the building was set on fire during the attack as a result of the ensuing chaos. The fire spread rapidly, leading to the complete destruction of the Second Temple, a central symbol of Jewish worship and identity. This destruction had immense religious, cultural, and political impacts. It marked the end of the Jewish temple-based worship system and led to significant changes in how the Jews practiced their religion. The loss only deepened the Jewish distaste surrounding Roman occupancy. However, Titus was commended as a war hero in Rome, with a great big arch being built in his name and honor. It is also around this time that Vespasian decided he would build a great big Colosseum. Nowadays, the Colosseum in Rome, back then the Colosseum was known as the Flavian Amphitheater, getting its name from the Flavian dynasty that they were within. The Colosseum's construction would continue for several years. Vespasian's reign was so far very successful, and as he had dealt with most of the issues at home, he decided to carry on his campaign in Britain. At this point, the north was being tamed by the Romans under the governorship of Vettius Bolanus and Carialis. Bolanus dealt with uprisings from the Brigantes and fought his way into Scotland, eventually building a fort at Carlisle. However, they were defeated and pushed back in 72 AD during the governorship of Cerialis. Failing to push into Scotland, the Roman army turned their attention towards the northwest and began in Lancaster, pushing through to Brougham, a small village within Cumbria. On the Cumbrian coast, Rome occupied the villages of Ravenglass and Blennerhassett, as well as potentially Beckfoot and Maryport. All of these villages gave Rome a bigger base within Britain and kept pushing their way forward. Carialis was getting old, and as such he needed to be replaced, so Frontinius was sent into Roman Britain in 74 AD to take over as governor. Frontinus returned to the conquest of Wales, and with steady growth was slowly able to subdue the southern Welsh tribes such as the Silures, establishing a new base at Caerleon and a network of smaller forests throughout Wales. During Frontinus's governorship, they had made significant pushes into Wales and had cemented their place in Roman history. Frontinus had achieved a lot of ground, and so resigned from his post in 78 AD to return to Rome as water commissioner. He would ultimately be replaced by Agricola. Shortly after, however, Agricola's campaigns were shadowed by a devastating event within Rome. In the autumn of 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted. It began violently throwing smog and molten rock with 100,000 times the thermal energy of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The eruption destroyed countless Roman towns, most famously being Pompeii and Herculaneum, which were completely obliterated and buried under the volcano's pyroclastic surges and ash. The same year as the Mount Vesuvius eruption, Emperor Vespasian began to feel unwell. He was traveling at the time and fell ill in Campania. Vespasian returned to Rome, all the while his illness was getting worse. He was overwhelmed with sickness, and while on his deathbed he exclaimed, "Vai, puto Deus fio," or in English, "Dear me, I think I am becoming a god." Vespasian passed away in June of 79 AD after fighting the illness. Vespasian is remembered for the welfare and beautification changes that occurred in Rome under his tenureship, although unfortunately, he would not live to see the conclusion of the Flavian Amphitheater. Following Vespasian, Titus succeeded the throne. Titus, the son of Vespasian, had a rather short tenureship, lasting only 2 years. Titus had gained renown as a military advisor in Judea during the First Jewish-Roman War, as well as leading the Praetorian Guard. However, as emperor, Titus is best known for completing the Colosseum and relieving the suffering caused by 2 natural disasters, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and a fire within Rome. After only 2 years in office, Titus died of a fever in September 81 AD and was deified by the Roman Senate before being succeeded by his younger brother Domitian. Both Titus and Vespasian were loved by the public and the Senate. However, Domitian's reign would have a few more problems, particularly with the Senate. Upon becoming emperor, Domitian quickly reformed the government, moving the center of government to the imperial court and rendering the Senate's power obsolete. Domitian believed that the Roman Empire was to be governed as a divine monarchy with himself at its head. Domitian wanted to change Rome and guide them as a cultural and moral authority. To bring in this new era of Roman history, he carried out ambitious economic, military, and cultural programs with the intention of restoring the empire to how it was under Emperor Augustus Octavian. Despite all of these policies and changes, Domitian was determined to govern the empire under an iron fist. He wanted to be involved in all branches of government and issue laws about the smallest details of everyday life, while taxation and public morals were viciously enforced. Roman philosophers of the time remark that the imperial bureaucracy never ran more efficiently than under Domitian, whose exacting standards and suspicious nature maintained low corruption rates amongst governors and elected officials. However, one thing Domitian had an issue with was the Senate, and expelled senators he felt were not worthy. One good thing that came from this, however, is that Domitian stopped the nepotism that had been practiced by Vespasian and Titus, no longer appointing officials based on family members, but rather who was good for that position. Domitian valued loyalty and malleability with those he assigned to strategic jobs. He favored former soldiers over the Senate or even his own family, who he was immensely suspicious of. If they disagreed with imperial policy, they would be removed. Domitian was well known for spending significant time away from the capital, which had not been common since the rulership of Emperor Tiberius. Although the Senate's power had been declining since the establishment of the Roman Empire, under Domitian, the Senate was no longer even in Rome, but rather wherever the emperor was. Domitian loved a life of luxury and built countless of the Roman structures we can see even to this day. For his personal use, he built the Villa of Domitian, the Palace of Domitian, as well as villas at Tusculum, Antium, Sabaudia, Vicarello, Caieta, Terracina, and Baiae, although only the one at Sabaudia has been identified. Domitian then built the Stadium of Domitian, which was intended to revitalize the economy following the Field of Mars fire in 79 AD. Domitian was actually making some positive cultural changes while making some immensely negative political reforms. However, the most notable event during Domitian's tenure was the Dacian Wars. Since the reign of Burebista, the greatest Dacian king, the Dacians had been a constant threat to the Roman Empire. Caesar had planned to lead an attack against Dacia, but the threat was reduced when Burebista died, and the tribes all dissolved. After over 100 years of peace along the Roman frontier, King Duras of Dacia swarmed over the Danube and pillaged Moesia, a Roman province. The Romans were caught by surprise and were completely annihilated in Moesia. Following this attack, Domitian led legions into the ravaged province and found it to be desecrated. As such, they reorganized the province into two areas and prepared to attack Dacia. With the arrival of fresh legions to Moesia in 87 AD, Domitian began what became the First Dacian War. General of the Roman army, Dearpanius, sent a fleet to offer peace to the Dacians, but was ultimately rejected. As such, prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Cornelius Fuscus, crossed the Danube into Dacia with 6 legions, but was ambushed at the First Battle of Tapai. Although Fuscus tried to rally his troops, the attempts failed, and Fuscus died in battle. Many soldiers within the Praetorian Guard were killed, and although the Praetorian cohorts would come back, the elite army was lost for good. It was potentially the most humiliating defeat that the Romans ever faced. After a year of preparations, Domitian promotes a new commander-in-chief, Tedius Julianus. Julianus was far more successful after crossing the Danube, as he managed to reach the plain of Karansebis, just in front of the Iron Gates, part of the boundary between modern-day Serbia and Romania. During the Second Battle of Tapai, the Romans were victorious and massacred the Dacians. Tedius, however, did not march into their capital of Sarmizegetusa Regia, due to the difficulty of crossing the Iron Gates this close to winter. The following year, there were more skirmishes within the area, with varying levels of success. The Roman victory had reduced the Dacian army considerably. However, internal revolts within Rome caused the war to come to an end, and Dacvia signed a peace treaty that kept the honor safe for both sides. Domitian was successful in the military. However, he was still quite opposed by the Senate, and this would eventually lead to his assassination of September 96th at the hands of court officials and the Senate. And from here on out, this time period is known as the Nerva Antonine dynasty, or sometimes also called the beginning of the 5 good emperors. First up was Nerva, a military veteran who had served under Nero and every succeeding ruler during the Flavian dynasty. Under Nero, he was a member of the imperial entourage. During Vespasian and Domitian reigns, he was a consul, and then upon Domitian's assassination, the Senate appointed Nerva the emperor of Rome. However, Nerva's rulership was brief. Nerva's reign was shadowed by financial difficulties and his inability to assert authority over the army. After a revolt by the Praetorian Guard in October 97, Nerva was forced to adopt an heir, and so chose to adopt Trajan, a young and popular general. After barely 15 months in office, Nerva passed away of old age and was succeeded by the second of the good five emperors, his son Trajan. Trajan succeeded the throne in 98 AD. Trajan was a decorated war hero who would go on to lead the Roman Empire to its largest size ever. Upon election, the first thing Trajan did was grant the plebeians a direct gift of money, meanwhile halving the donations that would go to troops. Similarly to Domitian shortly before him, the relationship between Trajan and the Senate was still quite sour. By faking reluctance to hold power, Trajan tricked the Senate into thinking he was going to give them more power, and this enabled him to control Rome even more. Trajan is certainly best remembered for his conquest of Dacia. Trajan took the Roman Empire to its largest size ever by winning 2 wars against Dacia, an area that had been problematic for Rome for a decade at this point. On May 1, Trajan launched an attack into the Dacian kingdom, crossing the northern bank of the Danube and defeating the Dacian army at Tapai. The following winter, King of the Dacians Decebalus launched a counterattack further downstream of the Danube, forcing Trajan to come to the aid of his troops, although the Dacians were pushed by after 2 battles in Moesia. Trajan's army used this opportunity to advance into Dacian territory, and a year later, Decebalus had to submit and renounce claim to part of his kingdom and surrender any war equipment or machines he had. The Dacians tried revolting against Trajan and the Romans in the Third Dacian War, but were ultimately defeated once again by the Romans, this time losing even more land. Although Trajan never claimed all of Dacian territory, countless more people tried revolting, but just could not stand up to the sheer size of the Roman army and were eventually wiped out. Trajan had successfully defeated the Dacians, a force that had opposed them for so long at this point. But unfortunately, Trajan's reign would have another war to deal with, the Parthian War. The Roman-Parthian Wars were a series of conflicts between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire. This was the precursor to a war that lasted 682 years between the Romans and the Persians. Battles between the Romans and the Parthians began in 54 BC, with the first incursion against Parthia being effortlessly repulsed. Come 150 years later, Emperor Trajan was making conquests towards the east and made the defeat of Parthia a strategic priority. However, during the Parthian Wars, while Trajan was returning to Rome from Syria, he died suddenly of a stroke. This sudden death meant that Hadrian, Trajan's cousin, succeeded the throne. Hadrian had no desire to control the Parthian Empire, and instead wanted to hold the Euphrates River as the limit of Roman control. Shortly before the death of Trajan, Rome reached their largest size ever, and Hadrian wanted to consolidate that. Hadrian is an interesting emperor, as one of the things he is most well known for is the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Nowadays, Hadrian's Wall is a national landmark within the UK, but at the time, it was a defensive bastion to separate the Roman province of Britannia from Scotland, running from Wallsend on the River Tyne into the east of Bowness on Solway, in the west of what is now considered northern England. Upon its completion, the wall stretched across 117 kilometers of land, and the wall really showcases Hadrian as an emperor. Hadrian believed in controlling the Roman Empire and keeping it intact. He had to deal with revolts from the Jews that had begun with Trajan and had been left undealt with. He then moved to quell disturbances along the Danube following the Dacian Wars. And the biggest rebellion definitely happened in 119 to 121 within Britannia, hence the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Hadrian traveled all across the empire, securing peace and stability throughout the empire, until 132 AD when Hadrian found himself in Jerusalem. In Roman Judea, Hadrian often visited Jerusalem, which was still in ruins 70 years after the First Roman-Jewish War. Hadrian planned to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony with privileges for Jews. The non-Roman population would not be obliged to participate in Roman religious activities, but were expected to go to war if they needed it. Then why would the Jews revolt against Hadrian? This all seems actually quite beneficial for them. Well, not entirely, since Hadrian's plans came with a couple of contingencies. Firstly, Hadrian wanted to ban circumcision throughout the empire, as he saw it as a type of mutilation. As such, a huge uprising broke out, led by Simon Bar Kokhba, nowadays called the Bar Kokhba Revolt. Roman governor Aeneas Rufus asked for any army to crush the resistance, while Bar Kokhba punished Jews who refused to fight against the Romans. The Romans were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the uprising, with Hadrian recalling troops from Britain and the Danube to quash the revolution. Roman losses were heavy, with around 4,000 soldiers being wiped out, and the rebellion lasted a few more years until 135, where the fortified city of Beitar fell after a 3.5-year siege. This war left 580,000 Jews dead and almost 1,000 villages destroyed. A considerable number of Jews were enslaved, and countless punitive measures were levied against the population. Hadrian renamed the province to Syria Palestina. He then renamed Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina after rebuilding it in a Greek style. After the revolt, Hadrian came to see the war as a cruel and sudden disappointment to his ambitions for the Roman Empire being unified. Hadrian had unfortunately never had a child, meaning he had no successor, and so he adopted one of the consuls for the year, Lucius Aelius Caesar, who died before he could succeed the throne. Hadrian then adopted Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus, who has potentially the longest name in Roman history. Seeing how challenging Antoninus's name was, he renamed himself to Antoninus Pius, and after the death of Hadrian, Antoninus succeeded the throne. And Antoninus had potentially the most peaceful emperor tenure within Roman history, with no recorded military acts during his tenure. Some disturbances did occur, such as disturbances in Judge in Britain. However, these were considered less serious than the revolutions prior. One thing that Antoninus did during his tenure was appoint Governor Quintus Lollius Urbicus, a Numidian native, to the war effort in Britain. Lollius invaded southern Scotland and won countless battles before constructing the Antonine Wall in 142 AD. This wall was intended to supersede Hadrian's wall and set up a border between Britain and Scotland. The wall was considerably smaller than Hadrian's wall, being only 63 kilometers wide. However, it was heavily defended due to it being far closer to the Scots than Hadrian's wall. And that is about all that happened under Antoninus. Antoninus pushed countless public health reforms, such as giving Romans free access to drinking water, as well as aqueducts, similar to a modern-day sewer. Antoninus also suspended tax collections from towns that were victims of natural disasters, such as fires or earthquakes, and regardless of this, Antoninus was building a pretty big cash surplus, although this would be depleted shortly after his reign. In 156 AD, Antoninus turned 70 and began to struggle with his strength. Marcus Aurelius became the heir for Antoninus back in 140 D, and as Antoninus aged, Aurelius took on more administrative duties. Antoninus Pius began to fall ill and grew a fever that eventually killed him. Antoninus Pius held the record for the second longest reign in Roman history that would not be beaten for 168 years until Constantine the Great came around. Antoninus Pius was the penultimate emperor during the 5 good emperors and was succeeded by Marcus Aurelius. Aurelius was an interesting emperor as he actually shared the throne alongside his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus. Under the rule of Antoninus and Lucius, Rome was immediately thrown back into wartime. The Marcomannic Wars broke out in 166 AD and lasted up until the year 180. These wars were fought between the Roman Empire and the Germanic Marcomanni. The Germanic Marcomanni were German people who established a powerful kingdom to the north of the Danube, and given the pre-existing tensions the Roman Empire had along the Danube, by the reign of Marcus Aurelius, these tensions had reached a critical point as the tribes along its borders decided that in order to survive, they had to break into Rome's territory. In late 166, an army of 6,000 Italians invaded Pannonia, modern-day Western Hungary. Their invasion was defeated with relative ease by the Romans. However, it marked the beginning of what was to come. The Romans tried to reach a peaceful settlement with the tribes that invaded Rome, but no permanent agreement was reached, and upon the killing of Pannonia's governor, the Romans prepared for war. However, this war effort was halted as a result of the Antonine Plague, which ravaged the Roman Empire. The expedition into Pannonia was meant to occur in 167, however was postponed until a year later when Marcus Aurelius, alongside his co-emperor Lucius Verus, set off from Rome and crossed the Alps into Pannonia. The Marcomanni and the Victuali had crossed the Danube into a Roman province. However, the news of the incoming Romans scared them off. The two emperors returned to their base of operations, but unfortunately, on the way, Marcus Aurelius's co-emperor passed away, and as such, Aurelius returned to Rome to bury Lucius Verus in January 169. In the autumn of that same year, Marcus left Rome and headed back to the Danube and the Roman province within Dacia in an attempt to. The tribal leaders of the Roman opponents were able to use the unorganized nature of the Roman Empire's army as a means of entering Roman territory and raiding it. To the east, the Costoboci crossed the Danube and began to ravage areas before entering the Balkans and reaching Eleusis shortly before Athens. It is here that they destroyed a Roman temple called the Eleusinian Mysteries. However, the most dangerous invasion came from the west, where tribal leader Balamar had formed a coalition of Germanic tribes to cross the Danube and win a huge battle against 20,000 soldiers at the Battle of Carnuntum. Balamar then led the larger portion of his army south to Italy. Rome had suffered a huge defeat, and this disaster forced Aurelius to reevaluate the Roman Empire's priorities. Forces from countless areas across the Roman Empire were dispatched against Balamar, with the future emperor Pertinax as one of his lieutenants. In 172 AD, the Romans crossed the Danube into Marcomannic territory and successfully defeated the Marcomanni and their allies, subduing the Marcomanni. Another faction causing problems for the Romans were the Quadi, who had broken their treaty with Rome and assisted their king, defeating them quickly. After these victories, the Romans focused their attention on the Iazyges, living in the plain of the river Tissa. After a couple of victories from the Romans, a treaty was signed where King Xanthicus delivered 100,000 Roman prisoners and 8,000 cavalrymen. Marcus Aurelius then marched east to take on the straggling Quadi, Marcomanni, and Naristi with ease, and the victory celebrations were carried out. The problem was, however, that Second Marcomannic War erupted just a year later, although this time far shorter due to the weakness of the Roman enemies. A third Marcomannic War came shortly after, however. This is not really that well documented. After 14 years and 3 wars, Marcus Aurelius had defeated the Germanic tribes and brought safety back to the Roman Empire. Exhausted from war, Marcus Aurelius would die the same year as the ending of the Marcomannic Wars and would be succeeded by his son Commodus. Commodus had actually ruled alongside Aurelius during the last 3 years of his reign, and as such, when he finally succeeded the throne, he was pretty experienced with the system. However, Commodus's reign was quite bizarre. Upon his succession, Commodus devalued the Roman currency by reducing the weight of the denarius, which was the largest devaluation since Emperor Nero. Commodus's reign was very different to Aurelius, as it was very peaceful in terms of warfare, while being quite turbulent politically. Commodus's years in power have been largely lost to time, and the documentation surrounding his rule is potentially the worst of any Roman emperor in history. Commodus had little interest in the administration side of emperorship, but rather would spend his reign leaving the practice of running the empire to others. People were growing dissatisfied in Commodus's leadership, and this caused a series of conspiracies and attempted coups, which eventually provoked Commodus to take control of leadership, albeit in a growingly dictator-like way. However, Commodus was popular with the army and plebeians for most of his reign, particularly due to his partaking in gladiator fights. Commodus was not a great combatant, as he killed animals by bow while standing out of the arena, while his fellow gladiators would be within the arena. When it came to Commodus fighting against fellow gladiators, they would often fake submit to Commodus. Due to this laissez-faire leadership from Commodus, the economy declined rapidly. In November 192, Commodus held the Plebeian Games, in which he shot hundreds of animals with arrows and javelins every morning and fought as a gladiator every afternoon, winning every fight. However, while all of this was going on, Commodus was conspiring to kill multiple people who opposed him. One of these people was Commodus's mistress Marcia, who found a list that Commodus had created, which had countless names of people who would be executed by Commodus, including Marcius and countless other officials. On 31st December, Marcia poisoned Commodus's food, but he vomited opium, the poison. So the conspirators sent Narcissus, Commodus's wrestling partner, to strangle him to death. Unlike previous emperors, Commodus's reign was not celebrated, but rather the Senate declared him a public enemy before burying him in the mausoleum of Hadrian. Commodus's death marked the end of the Nerva Antonine dynasty and began the year of the five emperors. The Roman year of five emperors refers to the year 193 AD, a period of civil unrest in the Roman Empire that is apparent due to there being five people who declared themselves emperor throughout the year. First, there was Pertinax, the successor of Commodus, who was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard just 3 months into his rule as a result of his horrendous Reformation policies, as well as his inability to satisfy the Praetorian Guard, who were used to a lack of discipline under Commodus. Pertinax was succeeded by Didius Julianus, who bought the empire from the Praetorian Guard before he too was quickly overthrown and defeated. Then along came Pescennius Niger, who deemed himself emperor in the eastern provinces. However, he would be killed the following year. Next came Clodius Albinus, who declared himself emperor of Britain and allied himself alongside Septimius Severus, although it would ultimately be Septimius Severus who emerged victorious during this year-long power struggle. Severus's succession sparked a new age in Roman history, the Severan dynasty. The Severan dynasty is far less glorified within history than the previous dynasties, with there being less historical moments than those of the previous dynasties. However, a lot of good did come from the Severan dynasty. Under Septimius Severus, the military faced immense reforms. Severus significantly increased both the size and pay for the army, making it far more loyal to him. This loyalty was crucial to him during the numerous campaigns against the Parthians as they captured the capital of Parthia, Ctesiphon. During the Battle of Ctesiphon, Severus had successfully taken over control of a huge city within Parthia as a result of his increased army. Severus also centralized power, further reduced the influence of the Senate, as well as increasing the authority of the emperor. Following Severus's death, Caracalla would take over ruling alongside his brother Geta. Caracalla's rule was not quite as long as that of Severus, and there were only a few key moments within his tenureship. Throughout the first year of being emperor, Caracalla began to become greedy for power and wanted to be the sole emperor of Rome. In order to achieve this, Caracalla killed his own brother and then proceeded to wipe out all of his supporters. With public backlash turning against Caracalla for this, Caracalla passed a law that would grant Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the Roman Empire. However, this ploy was to also increase how much they could tax other colonies within the empire. As for the military, Caracalla continued to wage the Parthian War, much like his father before him, and come 217 AD, the people were once again becoming disillusioned with their emperor, and Caracalla was assassinated in 217 AD. With Caracalla out of the picture, a Praetorian prefect decided it would be his chance to take charge of the Roman Empire. In came Macrinus, who following the assassination of Caracalla would become the first ever emperor of Rome, not from the senatorial class. However, Macrinus did something that he should have learnt was a bad idea from history. He reduced the benefits which Severus had laid out just years prior towards the army. The army were outraged at these policy changes, and as such, he was overthrown by the next emperor, Elagabalus, and his supporters in 218 AD. The Severan dynasty really shows that the people were tired of dictators changing everything within their tenureship, and it seems that Elagabalus was the final straw for them. While the country still fought the Parthian Wars, Elagabalus began to implement some religious reforms throughout the empire. Elagabalus began to promote the worship of the sun god Elagabal, whom he was named after, which caused outrage in Rome. He then tried to integrate this Eastern god into the Roman pantheon by building a grand temple to Elagabal in Rome. Elagabalus was very eccentric and controversial, and had a huge disregard for Roman traditions. This disregard would eventually lead to him being overthrown by his grandmother in favor of his cousin, Severus Alexander. Severus Alexander was the final ruler of the Severan dynasty, which at the point of his succession had 6 emperors within 10 years. Severus Alexander had only one goal in mind: to restore stability and traditional Roman values back to the empire. As such, Severus Alexander put a huge focus on economic and administrative reforms, trying to undo the changes that were made by his predecessors. Meanwhile, trouble was brewing in the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanid Empire was a very new empire, with it only being founded halfway into Alexander's tenureship. However, despite being relatively new, it quickly became a formidable power in the East, even able to challenge Rome. Under Alexander, the Romans first encountered the Sassanids when Ardashir I launched raids into Roman territory. These raids caused significant damage to Roman territories and would cause a war between them that would last for decades. But during Alexander's reign, the Romans just could not pull out a victory. They kept facing severe losses to the Sassanids, and with dissatisfaction growing amongst the Roman army, Severus Alexander would be assassinated by his own soldiers in an event that is responsible for the downfall of the Roman Empire, the crisis of the 3rd century. During the next 70 years, Rome would have 20 different emperors, with all of them failing to stabilize the empire. Sometimes referred to as the imperial crisis, the crisis of the 3rd century was a period of immense instability for the Roman Empire, which can be split up into 4 distinct sections: political instability, military defeats, economic collapse, and social revolution. So let's start with political instability. As previously mentioned, the crisis began after the assassination of Emperor Alexander Severus. The rapid turnover of emperors during this time period highlighted the increasing appearances from the army in political matters. Emperors such as Maximum Thrax exemplify this role, as he was proclaimed emperor by the army, not the Senate. Thrax's rule was marked by heavy taxation to support military campaigns, which led to his unpopularity and then his eventual assassination. However, the shattering of the political system did not stop there, as the Roman Empire began to fragment away from each other. First, there was the Gallic Empire, including Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Then, there was the Palmyrene Empire of the eastern provinces, including Syria and Egypt. Losing these empires continued to weaken the central authority of the Romans, but also diverted critical resources and attention away from some brewing external threats. In terms of the military, Rome were facing relentless invasions and pressures on multiple fronts. The Germanic tribes kept launching attacks across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. In the east, the Sassanid Empire continued to pose a huge threat, capturing large and key territories within Rome, and even Emperor Valerian in 260, an unprecedented humiliation for Rome. And these defeats only continued to overextend and overstress the military. The reliance on the military to manage the emperors further eroded the stability of the empire, with each usurper and successor emperor leaving the empire weaker and weaker as resources were being diverted away from defending borders to prevent internal power struggles. And this imbalance of resources led to a huge economic crisis. The empire faced hyperinflation and currency devaluation due to the increased minting of coins with less silver in them in an attempt to fund the ever more expensive military expenses. The devaluation of currency led to a loss of confidence in the Roman coins, which disrupted trade and caused immense price hikes for goods and services. Trade routes were being disrupted by both internal conflicts and invasions. Agricultural production plummeted, leading to starvation and famine. The financial strain was only made worse by heavy taxation to support the army and administration, leading to immense economic hardship amongst both the plebeians and the patricians. And socially, this crisis deeply affected the Roman Empire. The plague of Cyprian, which struck around this time, caused significant mortality and weakened the empire's numbers, and when combined with continuous warfare against countless enemies, the population was declining, leading to labor shortages, which impacted both the trade economy as well as the production economy. The administrative structure of the empire could not cope with these various crises, and their ability to enforce policies and maintain order got weaker and weaker, with independent authorities running their own districts. The Senate, once the most powerful institute on the globe, saw its influence continually decline as the military took more and more control over the government. Despite all of these challenges, some emperors did as much as they could to try and stabilize the empire. Emperor Aurelian of 270 AD played a crucial role in reuniting the fragmented empire defeating both the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway empires, restoring Roman control over these territories. Aurelian also initiated economic reforms, introduced a new coinage with a higher longevity, and attempted to fortify the Roman borders with new defensive structures, such as the Aurelian walls around Rome. However, the crisis would not truly end until Emperor Diocletian was installed as emperor in 284 AD. Diocletian implemented huge reforms that fundamentally transformed the Roman Empire for the rest of history. He recognized that the empire was now too big for a single ruler, and so implemented the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire into 4 parts, each ruled by 2 people, a senior emperor and a junior emperor. This system aimed to restore administrative efficiency in the various provinces of the Roman Empire, but also enable cities to better defend themselves from invasion. Diocletian also brought in countless economic reforms trying to stabilize the currency and curb inflation for good. He introduced measures to standardize taxation and control prices of goods. Although it was not entirely successful, it was a huge start to restoring the Roman Empire. The Tetrarchy, in particular, would be the system that ultimately led to the creation of countries within Europe after the dissolution of the empire. But we are not there just yet. First, we need to take a look at potentially the biggest event of Diocletian's reign, the Great Persecution of Christians. By the time Diocletian became emperor, the Christian religion had become one of the largest religions within the empire, establishing countless communities throughout the empire. However, because the Roman Empire was polytheistic, the exclusive single deity religion of Christianity was seen as aggravating and potentially destabilizing. So Diocletian, desperate to retain order, passed a law that ordered the destruction of Christian scriptures and places of worship, while also prohibiting Christians from assembling for worship and stripping them of their legal rights and privileges. This began a series of laws or edicts passed by Diocletian, with the second one ordering the arrest and imprisonment of the Christian clergy. The third act went even further, with the Christian clergy being forced to worship the Roman gods or face execution. The final edict extended that requirement to every Christian, threatening those who refused with torture and death. However, all of these edicts just proved the resilience of Christianity, and the persecution began to slow down a lot following the death of Diocletian. Diocletian was getting older, and so he decided it would be in the empire's best interest for him to step down as emperor. However, this stepping down caused even more instability. Once he retired, the Tetrarchy system collapsed, and without the guiding hand of Diocletian, the empire fell into countless civil wars, that is, until Constantine came in. After the death of Diocletian, the throne was contested. Not one person seemed to have a total claim to the throne, and as such, countless battles began amongst the claimants. Constantine the Great was one of these claimants. During the years 306-312, Constantine fought against his rivals to protect the throne. Firstly, he defeated his main rival Maxentius and saw a vision of a Christian cross pushing him to convert to Christianity. Following this, Constantine would go on to pass the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity alongside his co-emperor Licinius. Constantine and Licinius had a good relationship initially during Constantine's consolidation of power. However, this relationship soured between the years 314 and 324, as Constantine met Licinius at the Battle of Chrysopolis, becoming the sole ruler of the Roman Empire and the first Christian ruler of the Roman Empire. Constantine was great in the sense that he fought for Christians and legalized their religion while bringing stability to the empire, unifying everyone under Christianity. In 330 AD, Constantine founded Constantinople, as well as establishing a new capital for the Roman Empire in Byzantium, modern-day Istanbul. 7 years after this, Constantine would fall ill and be baptized on his deathbed, fully into the Christian faith. As he died, his 3 sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, succeeded him and split the empire up between the 3 of them. Constantine II was given control over Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Constans was given control over Italy, Africa, and the Balkans, and then Constantius II was given control over the East, and eventually became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire after the deaths of his 2 brothers. However, the Constantine children set a new trend for the Roman Empire in that it would be divided up amongst multiple rulers. This trend was continued by Valentinian I and his brother Valens, with Valentinian ruling the west, while his brother ruled the east. The final emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire was Theodosius, who made Christianity the official state religion during his reign between the years of 379 and 395. After his death, the empire was split again between the east and the west. The Western Empire faced countless weak and ineffective empires, which led to various Germanic tribes migrating into Roman territory, driven away from their land by the Huns. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman army was constantly defeated by the Visigoths, which eventually led to the death of Valens and the exposing of the Roman army for what it now was, weak. The final collapse of the Western Roman Empire happened under Romulus Augustulus in 476 AD, when he was deposed by Germanic chieftain Odoacer, who declared himself king of Italy, ending the Western Roman Empire. However, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to thrive, eventually being renamed to the Byzantine Empire. It preserved its Roman identity all the way up to 1453 AD, when Constantinople fell. The dissolution of the Roman Empire happened after Constantine split up the empire between his sons, and with barbarians, civil wars, economic trouble, and more plaguing the Western Empire, eventually the Roman Empire would completely dissolve. Roman influence can still be found throughout these countries, with countless historic landmarks such as the Roman Colosseum, Hadrian's Wall, and more still around to this day.